Good singing, man. Good singing. Thank you, Monsieur. It's beautiful. I love that. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. As I mentioned to you last week, arguably Genesis 1:1 is the most important statement ever written or spoken by a man. Arguably the most important verse in the Bible. Genesis 1:1 is true. The implications for mankind are nothing less than eternal. We have a creator. There is a lawgiver. He is our judge, and we are accountable to him if Genesis 1:1 is true. And it matters every single day when we get up how we live before this awesome God. If Genesis 1:1 is false, ultimately nothing really matters at all. Everything is senseless and meaningless. We are merely the product of some inexplicable, cataclysmic, cosmic chance event. Took me a while to practice on that one. Existence, again, is meaningless. We are merely grown-up germs, as I said last week, waiting to become fertilizer. The 20th century theologian and apologist Francis Schaeffer said it perfectly. He said, "It is either not knowing or denying the createdness of things that is at the heart of the blackness of modern man." I think that's perfect. It's either not knowing or denying the createdness of things that is at the heart of the blackness of modern man. Genesis 1:1, as I said to you earlier, is the indispensable truth for mankind. If you remove Genesis 1:1, all bets are off. Everything is permitted. Russian author and existentialist Fyodor Dostoevsky said it like this. Some of you know this quote. If God does not exist, then what? Everything's permitted. If God does not exist, if Genesis 1:1 is false, then everything is permitted. In his book entitled, "Can Man Live Without God?" Ravi Zacharias actually is asking this question: can man live without God in a reasonable way? And his conclusion is, of course, no, he cannot. Without a point of reference such as God, and I'm quoting Ravi Zacharias, a person ultimately denies moral law, abandons hope, and forfeits all meaning. Man is then left to design his own absolutes by which to live. The inevitable result is chaos. The 20th century gives evidence of this truth, that man cannot live in a reasonable way without God. It's no coincidence that the 20th century is the bloodiest century in the history of humanity. The 19th century amateur naturalist named Charles Darwin, who we talked about some last week, he in effect pronounced God unnecessary. 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche pronounced God dead. Is it any wonder that the 20th century was the bloodiest in human history? Does it surprise anyone that Adolf Hitler was a Nietzsche fan and he was a Darwinist? Now, I'm not alleging that to be a Darwinist is to be a Nazi. That's not what I'm saying. But I am making the connection. I am going to make the connection. Hitler used atheistic Darwinism philosophy to justify his ends. He took that worldview to its horrible, logical, ultimate conclusion. I actually heard a historian say, I was doing some research this week, heard a historian say that Hitler would have told you he was doing mankind a service. He was only helping along survival of the fittest. Okay? He was only helping along natural selection. He was advancing mankind in the evolutionary struggle. This is what Adolf Hitler would have told you. with regard to his policies. Another fan of macro-Darwinism was a gentleman named Karl Marx. Some of you will recognize that name. Marx was actually a contemporary of Darwin. He loved Darwin's teachings. In fact, he sent an autographed copy of his book, Das Kapital, to Darwin, and he actually asked Darwin if he could dedicate his subsequent book to him. Marx was a big fan. Darwin implied that God was unnecessary. Dostoevsky pronounced God dead. Nietzsche pronounced him dead, and Dostoevsky said, if that's true, everything's permitted. And we've seen it. We've seen it in the 20th century. The Nazis and the Marxists understood the implications of atheistic, macro-Darwin evolutionary philosophy. Hitler murdered tens of millions. The Marxists, Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, and others, murdered hundreds of millions. Dissident Russian author Alexander Solzhenitsyn said it perfectly. Listen to what he said. If you asked me what the main cause of the ruinous revolution that swallowed up millions of people, I could not put it more accurately than to repeat, men have forgotten God. That is why all of this has happened. That brings me back to Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And what I want you to hear, beloved, is this is an awesome revelatory gift from God. He's told us He is there, and existence means something. It is not senseless. It means something. Simply by virtue of the fact that He created us, it is meaningful. We are accountable to Him. We must live in accordance with His dictates. He is our absolute that we build our life around. Genesis 1:1 is true. God is our absolute upon which we build our life. And the other thing we learned from Genesis 1:1, we touched on this last week, God is irrepressibly awesome. He speaks and worlds stand forth. He is the awesome Creator God. There is no one beside Him. There is no one like Him. He stands alone. He is utterly unique in the cosmos. He is the great uncreated one. A lot of theology in Genesis 1:1. I think I could preach Genesis 1:1 for probably a year. I'm not going to do that. But I think I could. An awesome God worth pursuing, worth knowing, worth worshiping, worth living for. And Genesis 1:1, in my view, is a theologically titillating proposition. Solomon told us in Ecclesiastes 3:11 that God has put eternity in our hearts. Friends, I've told you this many times. God has put eternity in our hearts. Nothing on this planet can fill your heart. There's only one person who can fill your heart, and His name is Jesus Christ. Oh, guess what? That's what He came to do. He came to redeem you and to fill you up. God in the gospel preeminently is giving Himself away to His people. It's an awesome thing. It's an awesome thing. He gives Himself to His people for the joy of His people. He redeems them for His glory and for their joy. It's awesome. It's an awesome thing. Jesus says, I give my people my joy. My joy. Do you know how big God's joy is? Anybody want to hazard a guess? How big is the joy of God? Amen. It's infinite. It's infinite. And this is what He's giving to His people. Infinite joy. Last week we touched on one of the attributes of God that's implicit in Genesis 1:1. That being God is eternal. The Bible is clear. God is in a category by Himself. He calls Himself I am. It connotes His transcendent, self-existent. He is the God who just is. Psalm 90 verse 2, before the mountains were